Once again, good morning. Our theme for this Advent and Christmas has been the characters of Christmas. And in our series so far, we've been looking at the various characters in the Christmas story to see what we can learn from them. We've looked at the prophets who predicted the birth of the Messiah, at Mary, a poor peasant girl who was willing to pay the price of personal dishonor in her family and community in order to be the mother of the Son of God. We've looked at Joseph, her betrothed, who assumed the responsibility of raising this child, and the undeserved shame that came with it, and the shepherds, the first to hear the news of the birth of the Christ, and the first to share it with others. And last week on Christmas Day, we looked at the main star of the story, the promised child. The celebration of Christmas has developed so many traditions and customs and marketing images and media presentations that it can be easy to forget, even for faithful Christians, that the point of Christmas is Jesus, the King who was born to be a Savior. And the gift in the manger includes the gift on the cross. And both are necessary in order to have that gift within us. Christmas as an ongoing reality, as Jesus, the incarnate Word of God, becomes flesh and blood in us, as we follow Him as His disciples and are being formed into His image. So I know that Christmas Day is past, but we're still in Christmas season, even if that's only in this sermon series. We will give a nod to the traditional Western church year calendar, which extends the celebration of Christmas through January 6th, the day of the Feast of Epiphany, when the church marks the coming of the Magi from the east. As for the Eastern church, well, they still follow the ancient Julian calendar, so January 6th is their Christmas. Extending the season is a good, even if it's just for a bit, and even if you've already taken down your Christmas decorations, because there's a bit more of the story that we need to investigate. Our characters today are these famous foreign visitors who came to see the one whom they called He who has been born King of the Jews. And they're variously known as the wise men or the three kings, or in the most accurate term, if not exactly the most helpful, the Magi. The Greek term that Matthew uses to introduce these characters, magoi, the plural of magos, is the source for the transliteration we now use, magi. But the term is wrapped in some mystery that we'll need to clear up to learn more about these shadowy figures. And quite honestly, the whole story is fairly mysterious, so clearing up what we can is a key part of what I'm going to try to do this morning as we explore this familiar story with these unfamiliar characters. Clearing up what we can is going to involve some clearing away. And much like the process in restoring a painting or the walls of a cathedral, what we need to do is to remove a lot of the stuff that has accumulated over the centuries and attached itself to the story so that it now obscures the meaning rather than helping us see the story for what the author intended for us to hear and understand. So maybe this can help. Think of this story as having 4 layers, or we're reading it at 4 layers. The first layer is the historical event. What happened? There are aspects of this historical event that we need to uncover as best we can so that we can understand the story in its historical context. And then the second layer is the narrative. That's the story itself, what the author tells us. And the narrative presents the historical events to us along with some guidance from the author in how to understand the significance of what it is he's telling us. It is this second layer that is critical for us to grasp, because it is here that we touch the Holy Spirit's inspired thoughts, which give us God's perspective on how to understand what happened in the events. The fourth layer is what we take away from the story once we rightly understand what God is saying to us through it. That is, what we understand from the story. And this is the layer that we always have to be reconsidering, because it can so easily be distorted by our own ideas, our own cultural presuppositions, our own preferences even. It's kind of like the frosting on top of the cake. It's great when it's right, not so great when it isn't. Bad frosting can ruin an otherwise great cake. And that's something we don't want to do for the Christmas story. It's the third layer that is the most difficult layer to deal with. That's the collection of traditions and add-ons to the story that have formed kind of a crust over the top of the actual story. That's what has been added to the story. Some of those traditions are helpful or at least benign, but some of them actually obscure what Matthew and God wanted to show us. They can hinder us rather than help us as we seek to understand the story and what it can teach us today. And so it's this third layer that we have to clear away if we want to really see the first and the second layers rightly, and then come away with a good understanding in our fourth layer. So let's start clearing away some of this accumulated clutter about the Magi, while we simultaneously look more closely at the historical event and the narrative itself to discover what it is that Matthew wants us to see. So first of all, we can dispense with a notion that's based on our nativity sets, which is that the Magi arrived at the same time as the shepherds. Matthew's account gives us no specifics at all about when the Magi arrived. These men arrived in Jerusalem after having noted a star in the sky which they took to be a sign of the birth of a king for the Jews. Their subsequent journey took an indeterminate amount of time. Certainly could not have been less than a few weeks. And based on what Herod ascertained from them about when they had first seen the star when they showed up to his palace, we can assume that their arrival in Jerusalem was not more than 2 years after the time the star appeared. And from Luke's account of the sacrifice that Mary and Joseph offered for her cleansing 40 days after childbirth, which we'll look at next week, from that account it is clear that Mary and Joseph were very poor, which means that they had not yet received the expensive gifts brought by the Magi. Therefore, the Magi must have arrived sometime after that sacrifice, which was about 6 weeks after Jesus' birth, but while the young family was still living in Bethlehem and before Jesus was 2 years old. Second, we can eliminate all of the traditions that claim to identify the Magi, their names and their nations of origin and their race and their ages and so on. Matthew gives us none of that info. He doesn't even tell us how many Magi there were. Western tradition counts 3 based on the number of gifts, but the Eastern Church tradition includes up to 12. And devout speculation has given us their names, their birthplaces, who gave which gift, how old they were relative to one another, and so on and so on and so on. So there's a multitude of wonderful works of art and literature and music that have built upon these traditions and speculation and given us beautiful and precious ideas on which to muse for devotional purposes. This painting of James Tissot is there on the screen before you. We're going to sing one of them at the close of the service today, the popular carol, We Three Kings. Well, that carol promotes the notion of the symbolic significance of the gifts. That's an idea that was articulated in the late 2nd century by a guy named Origen, and it's carried through the Christian years ever since. Now, whether Origen came up with that idea himself or whether he was simply reporting on something that was widely known in the church, we can't say, and I don't know for sure. I know that I love the song. I love thinking about the symbolism of the gifts, but I also want to remember that this tradition may not actually represent what Matthew was trying to tell us. Third, we can clear away some of the claims that attempt to identify the astronomical phenomenon that the Magi viewed. Matthew simply refers to it as a star in the singular, meaning some kind of light seen from the sky from a heavenly body of whatever type. And various proposals have been given to us over the centuries that it was a comet or it was a conjunction of planets, which actually would not have appeared to be a single star, or it was a nova or a supernova. None of these quite fit what the text describes. As Hugh Ross, an astronomer of Reasons to Believe ministry, points out, to be the Christmas star, a naturally occurring astronomical appearance would have to match 4 criteria to match with what the text says. It must be A, a single object, B, rare in its occurrence, C, yet not so spectacular as to be visible to everyone in order to explain how others failed to make any note of it at the time, as they did of other astronomical appearances, and D, 4, whichever, I forgot how I was counting, able to appear and disappear and then reappear in the same place. Now, Ross says that a possible exception that fits these criteria would be something called a recurring nova, but that is still just an educated guess. But if none of these options fits the text, that does leave a possibility that is often not considered, which is namely that the star was not a naturally occurring phenomenon, that it was in fact a supernatural sign that simply appeared to be a star, at least to the Magi who followed it. The attempt to identify an astronomical phenomenon is really about trying to establish evidence for the truthfulness of the account. It's as if we were saying, if we were saying to ourselves, if we can show that there was something that can be demonstrated to have happened and was visible about the time that Jesus was said to have been born, about 4 BC in our calendar, well, then that adds credence to the Christian account of the birth of Christ and supports the truthfulness of the Bible. Yes. The problem, of course, is though that even if we can identify a likely phenomenon, if we can demonstrate that it was visible in lands to the east of Israel around the time of Jesus' birth, there's still no way to prove that Matthew's story is true. The best we can hope for is that we can provide a reasonable explanation that may be what Matthew was describing. But therein lies the problem, and I think it's a problem that can set us up for failure. For in seeking to prove an inherently unprovable minor point, we may miss the main point altogether. Identifying the Christmas star may be an interesting sideline, but finding the importance of the Magi themselves in the story is the real goal. So who were these Magi, these foreign visitors on a journey to find a king? Well, the answer is going to take just a little more clearing up. They weren't kings. Now, it's not hard to see why the tradition developed, and the tradition can be traced clear back to the second century again, to a man named Tertullian, at least that far. Prophetic passages like Isaiah 60, verses 1 through 7, spoke of foreign kings bringing offerings to the restored Jerusalem to honor Yahweh for what he had done to bring salvation to his people. Verse 3 says, "Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn." Psalm 72, verses 8 to 11, similarly expects the obeisance of foreign rulers to the royal son of David. "May he rule from sea to sea," the psalmist says, "and from the river to the ends of the earth. May the desert tribes bow before him, and his enemies lick the dust. May the kings of Tarshish and of distant shores bring tribute to him. May the kings of Sheba and Seba present him gifts. May all kings bow down to him, and all nations serve him." As does Psalm 68, verses 28-29. "Summon your power, God. Show us your strength, O God, as you have done before. Because of your temple at Jerusalem, kings will bring you gifts." So this expectation runs throughout the Old Testament. It's not hard to see why the early church might have seen in the coming of the Magi with their gifts a fulfillment of these scriptures. Foreign rulers sending offerings in praise of what God had done for these people. And having recognized that, it was a small step then to simply call these visitors kings. And quite honestly, it can be forgiven them, because even though it was a misstep in the sense of identifying the Magi according to their historical roles, it was accurate in seeing what it was that the Magi represented. That term, Magi, a bit strange in our ears, was actually very common in Western Asia and Eastern Mediterranean regions. Magi were particularly common in Persia, where the term denoted a class of religious priests who were renowned for their study of exotic and mystical knowledge, which hence we get the word magic from this. And especially they were known for their knowledge of astronomy, which at the time was closely connected to astrology, but still involved very careful analysis of the positions of the stars and planets. In one sense, they were the scientists of their day. And similar castes of priest astrologers could also be found at that time in Babylon, in India, in Egypt, and elsewhere. So while we cannot say for certain exactly where these visitors came from, since Matthew says that they came from the east, the most likely place would have been from Babylon or from Persia. And because they were familiar with a variety of religious traditions and the Magi sought out esoteric knowledge from other cultures, it's quite likely that the Magi would have had considerable contact with the well-established Jewish community there in Babylonia and the rabbinic schools that were there. With those connections then, they could easily have gained access to the sacred literature of the Hebrews, including the prophetic books with their descriptions of the promised Redeemer King, the Messiah of Israel. But whether it was through their own independent study of the Jewish prophets or through their conversations with the Jewish rabbis in Babylonia or Persia, some of these magi from that region of the world became aware of the promise in the Hebrew Scriptures of a momentous king to come, the Son of David who would deliver his people. And among the various predictions from the Jewish Scriptures, one stood out, perhaps because of their predisposition toward associating the stars with signs and omens. The book of Numbers, chapter 24, verse 17. A Gentile, non-Jewish prophet named Balaam says this, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. And thus it was that certain priest astrologers from Babylon or Persia noticed a rare but significant sign in the sky, perhaps a nova or a supernatural appearance of a star. And somehow it was connected in their minds to the land of Judea and to the people of Israel, and it signaled the birth of a promised king, a great king, a king who would be, by his birth, the rightful king of Israel. And they set out to pay him homage. By the way, just a few decades later, we have recorded in Roman historians that a Parthian king, motivated by omens identified by his magi, came to visit the Emperor Nero and to pay him homage, demonstrating that neither the idea nor the practice was entirely foreign to the times. Matthew wasn't just making this up out of whole cloth. Now, we don't know why they thought it was important to come, why they wanted to seek out this king of a people that they knew of but were not part of. And we could speculate about motivations or imagine possible revelations they might have received, but that would all be just guesswork, and not even very educated guesswork at that. Nor can we draw conclusions about their spiritual condition based on Matthew's use of the term when he describes their intended actions. He says, we've come to worship him. The Greek verb there, to worship, as it's translated in our NIV, means to prostrate oneself or to bow or kneel before someone else. Matthew might be saying simply that they prostrated themselves before the child as a sign of their recognition of his superior status. Or it could mean that they were acknowledging him as royalty. Or that they were giving him their personal obeisance. Or it could be something greater than that. But we don't know what was in their hearts based on just what the text tells us. What we do know is that Matthew emphasizes some things in his presentation of the birth of Jesus, and what he emphasizes gives us a lot of key clues to what he intends for us to grasp. First, from what we see from Matthew's gospel as a whole, we know that Matthew is writing to a mixed audience, an audience that includes both Gentiles and Jews. But that audience of Gentiles and Jews is closely connected to the Jewish community. It cares very deeply about Jewish concerns. It's strongly influenced by what the Pharisees think. And it's very sensitive to questions about the meaning and the applicability of the Mosaic Law and the fulfillment of prophecies from the Scriptures. For that audience, Matthew cites authorities whom they would respect to provide evidence of Jesus' claim to be the Messiah, such as the prophet Micah, such as angelic voices, such as what God has already said to his people. Second, Matthew has been very explicit about introducing his gospel with this birth narrative that presents Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of David. He clearly wants his readers to know from the beginning that he is presenting an account that demonstrates who Jesus is and supports that claim with evidence. So in the earlier part of his story, we've already seen the divine declaration through the angel that the Son of the Virgin, Jesus, would be the one who would save his people, and that this was a fulfillment of a prophecy related to God's promise to send a king who would deliver his people. Now, in the story about the Magi coming, Matthew gives us three clear indications that he is identifying Jesus as the rightful king of Israel, the promised son of David, the promised Messiah. First of all, the Magi refer to him as he who has been born king of the Jews. That statement does not mean that he will someday become king of the Jews. It means that he is, by his birth and at his birth, the born king of the Jews, the rightful king of Israel. And that is a situation that has not been the case for nearly 6 centuries, since the year 587 BC. There had been a few Jewish kings recently under the Hasmoneans. They had ruled over a portion of what was once Israel, but none of them were descendants of David, and none of them were independent of foreign powers. Secondly, Matthew tells us that his birth is a threat to the sitting king of Israel, Herod the Great. And Herod the Great was not only not a descendant of David, he was not even a full Jew. And that was a fact that was well known throughout Judea and the Jewish communities in the region. Herod was an Idumean. Actually, the Idumeans were the same as the Edomites, ancient enemies of the Jews. And he had originally procured the title of king from the Romans by supporting Mark Antony in his battle with Octavius. And he then married a granddaughter of the former Hasmonean ruler, a man named Hyrcanus II, to strengthen his claim to the throne. But then when Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra, well, Herod was in a stew. What did he do? Well, he managed to convince Octavius that he would be loyal to him, he would protect Rome's interests in Judea and the surrounding region, and he managed to keep his crown as a client king for the Roman emperor. So Herod's position on the throne was therefore vulnerable to counterclaims by others, and that helps explain his ruthlessness in eliminating anyone he considered a potential rival, including his own sons. So the Magi's announcement of one who was born with a royal claim was therefore something that Herod would not take lightly. And Matthew is presenting this Jesus as the one making the counterclaim. Thirdly, the passage from Micah that is quoted by the scribes clearly points to Bethlehem as the birthplace of the Messiah, which Matthew has already told us at the start of this chapter was where Jesus was born. And the scribes who inform Herod of the prophecy give tacit confirmation that this prophecy applies to Jesus, even though they don't acknowledge it themselves. Herod likewise gives credence to its prediction. By virtue of the fact that he sent the Magi to Bethlehem, he tells them where to look for this king who's been born. The Magi themselves give evidence of the accuracy and the relevance of the prophecy by proceeding to follow to Bethlehem. And even the star itself adds divine confirmation that the original sign to the Magi is continuing to lead them as they proceed to Bethlehem. But Matthew wants us to see more than a simple prophecy identifying some individual as the Messiah. And so he gives us a third thing to note. His narrative points us to the proper response that he is urging his readers. That response is found in the actions of the Magi, who are contrasted with both the scribes and with Herod. And here is where our first two levels merge to show us how to read the events and their significance. Because the actions of the Magi show that they are more than simply curious students. They're not just traveling to see if they've accurately interpreted the omens from the stars. What do we see from them when we read this account? We see that they have taken great efforts to determine the meaning of this heavenly portent. A new star in the sky is not a self-evident omen in its significance. So there had to be numerous conversations and debates and consultations with others over the relevant texts of Scripture, weighing the options of what it could signal, and more. Now, Granted, we understand that the biblical teaching in both the Old and New Testaments forbids consulting with sorcerers, condemns astrology as false prophecy. But God has a way of speaking to people right where they're at. And He can even do so through means that we would consider superstitious or flaky. I don't know if you know this or not, but even in the Scriptures, God spoke truth through a pagan prophet in the Old Testament, Balaam, the guy we quoted just a little bit ago in Numbers chapter 22 to 24. He also did so through a corrupt and unbelieving high priest in the New Testament. That's Caiaphas in John chapter 11, 49 to 52. God saw that these magi were sincere in seeking the truth, that they were actually open to hearing the truth, and so He answered them in a way that they could understand. He gave a sign that they interpreted, rightly as it turns out, as the mark of a new king being born, a king associated with Judea. Now, even though that isn't exactly kosher, we would say, He still did it. And He led them to pursue Him and to learn the truth more adequately. Secondly, we look at the Magi's actions and we see that they prepared for a lengthy and expensive journey in order to accomplish two things. They wanted to learn who this new king was, and they wanted to honor Him as king with their obeisance. And so they prepared very costly gifts, gifts that would be worthy of a great king, in order to demonstrate the sincerity of their recognition of Him. Now think about this for just a moment. These magi have no reason, naturally, to head out on this difficult, somewhat perilous journey. They have a fully paid government job with good benefits, right? Their own king is a powerful, fairly powerful ruler, and the Jews are not especially a rival that they should fear or even wonder about. Judea is a small and insignificant client state that is part of a powerful and growing empire to their west. Now that king, the king of that empire is someone that they might be concerned about, not whoever's ruling in the moment in Judea. And yet, the Magi were struck with the importance of this singular act of honoring this king who's just recently been born, a king of a people whom the world barely noticed. And not only did they undertake this grand journey to witness who this king was for themselves, they were determined to honor him as a king ought to be honored with lavish and costly gifts, as if he deserved their very lives. Third, we look at the Magi story and we see they not only sacrificed in order to present him with costly gifts, time and effort and treasure. They showed him honor befitting his station. They also came and bowed before him. Again, if we think historically, if we recognize what the text allows, we cannot say that the Magi meant anything more than simply recognizing this person, recognizing his social status of being honored and honored above themselves. But he was a king. Now, no doubt they were shocked to find him where they did in this small and unremarkable village. But they believed the signs that God gave them. They believed the prophetic scriptures, at least enough to follow where they led. And when they saw the child, they bowed themselves and acknowledged him as Lord. And Matthew wants us to do the same and more. Because Matthew intends us to see what the Magi may not have realized. That Jesus is not only the Son of David and a king, an earthly king. He is the Son of God. He is Emmanuel, the infinite God come to live as a human. He is therefore worthy not only of sacrificial giving and formal homage and deference, he is worthy of our personal worship, for he is truly divine. And we should note this as well. Matthew has chosen these characters, these Magi, to represent an entire group of people, the Gentiles, the non-Jews. And it is no accident that he is showing us their receptivity to acknowledging Jesus as Messiah and Lord, even though, must be said, these Magi are thoroughly enmeshed in religions that are deficient in understanding the true God. They're engaged in practices that open themselves up to demonic influence, things that God would not approve of. Yet all the while, he is also showing us that their willingness to acknowledge Jesus as Messiah is to be emulated by contrasting it with the lack of response or even the hostile response of those who are the Jewish religious and governmental leaders. Where then does that leave us as we read this Christmas story? Well, we can jettison or we can just ignore the added trappings of legend and amplification. We can put aside some of the historical questions, at least until there's evidence that's more than just conjecture. We have some historical knowledge that helps us place these characters in the right setting, and we can open our hearts to the inspired text so that Matthew's intended meaning becomes our determined conviction. We acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah, the rightful King of Israel, the Son of David, and the Son of God, who deserves not only our sacrifices of treasures that we can give, but the sacrifice of our lives, poured out for his sake and his use. Those who are wise still seek him. So let's us determine that we will still seek him and we will worship him as befits his majesty.